I right now am a stranger in the country that I grew up in.
When you've had the acts of violence and the killings that we've just had in the last 10 days, in some ways that does represent already a kind of civil war.
Religion is about action. It's not about thought processes. It's about living as kindly and compassionately as possible.
Worldwide, more than 8 in 10 people identify with a religious group. 84% of the global population claims a faith affiliation.
How could those beliefs affect a world in crisis mode? Famine in Yemen, genocide in Myanmar, refugee and mass migration, homelessness, restrictions on human rights, racial and political divides, social media hate mongering.
Today on Context from the Parliament of the World's Religions in Toronto, we ask, can religion heal our world?
I'm Lorna Duick.
I'm Sheldon Neal.
And I'm Molly Thomas.
And this is Context. What is the faith response to undocumented migrants? Professor, author, and filmmaker Miguel de la Torre tells his own experience of coming to the U.S. from Cuba as a child.
Karen Armstrong, a former Catholic nun who documents the world's religious history in her book, Fields of Blood, calls on religions to now unite through a compassion charter.
And too close to genocide. Human rights lawyer Irwin Cotler says we can help prevent genocide underway across our globe.
And could Canada dismantle hate over a Christian woman needing asylum? The case of Asya Bibi, a mother of 5 at the center of a firestorm over religious blasphemy in Pakistan. Canada has been asked to grant her refugee status.
Okay, so all this week the Context team attended the world's religious parliament. And wasn't it a great time, you guys, speaking with so many experts on how to apply our faith to a world in crisis?
It was quite amazing. There was more than 10,000 people out there. We had people from 80 different nations, more than 200 spiritual backgrounds. And the conference, the whole point was not to just focus on unity, but more so interreligious harmony.
Okay. And it just was a fascinating time, Sheldon.
That's right. We had major leaders from civil and human rights, the environment, the Me Too movements, all really coming together at the conference, calling us to really move beyond self-interest and realize really what it is, a common good.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now an interesting note about religion here in Canada. Take a look at this graph.
Wow, you're going to see here a lot of numbers there, but you'll see over 78% of Canadians identify as Christians, and approximately 20% of Canadians identify as having no religious affiliation at all. Wow.
Okay, well, let's get started because this question of how to heal the world was violent long before religion got blamed for it. That's the writing of religious historian Karen Armstrong. Religion, she writes, was co-opted by powers to organize violence. She's now pushing for a charter for compassion. Here's her visit with Molly Thomas.
Karen, you have said that religion has been hijacked.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think I said that close after September the 11th, when hijacking was very much in the air. But there are extremists around who have hijacked religion and used it in a way for which it was never intended. And that has also given people the impression that religion is inherently violent, which is not the case.
So what is it? What is religion meant for?
Religion is an art form. It expresses itself in terms of art and doesn't express itself well in rational thought. But it's a way of making sense of our world, like art.
I know in your own life, you were a Catholic nun at one time, left the faith, took a hiatus, maybe you might say, and then came back in a sense. What would you say you believe now at this point?
Belief is not on my agenda.
Okay.
That's one of the things that have gone wrong with religion in the modern period. We associate religion now with believing a whole lot of dubious propositions. Religion is about action. It's not about thought processes. It's about living as kindly and compassionately as possible, and that gives life meaning.
So let me ask you about that action. In today's world, I think of even the caravan of people that are moving towards the U.S., right? Thousands of people that are saying, we want to seek asylum, we want a safe place to live. It's a tough proposition when you have people that need help. At the same time, can we fit everybody in a country like the U.S.? What do we do?
We don't know. This is something that we've brought upon ourselves by advertising our great wealth and comfort. We put it out in advertisements, films. They see our comfortable, rich lives, and obviously they want to share in it. We've also, our policies in the past have often made these countries impossible for people to live in. And I have no solution to this, but this is something we should be grappling with now, trying to find a solution, because this is not going to be a temporary thing, where this is in for the long haul. And so somehow we have to put our heads together and think creatively about this.
How do we, I guess, mobilize religious communities to be more compassionate people, to care about the other, to not only think about ourselves?
Well, that's what we're trying to do with the Charter, of course. And there has been an extraordinary response, I must say. The Charter's now in 400 cities worldwide, which have devoted themselves for making their cities a compassionate place.
Are you hopeful that compassion is actually a virtue that's going to spread?
It must spread, or we won't survive. I don't like to say I'm hopeful, because that makes me sound facile and facilely optimistic. But I am more hopeful since I came to the Parliament. I felt this week a real sense of hope and purpose that I hadn't felt for some time.
There were plenty of other things we did together, and there's no reason that would stop simply because the House now becomes Democratic.
Today is more than about Democrats and Republicans. It's about restoring the Constitution's checks and balances to the Trump administration.
Well, there were religious voters turning up for those midterm elections, and it's resulted in a more balanced House and Senate, with a big win for the Democrats on that vote. Well, up now is a legendary guest from the U.S., 90-year-old civil rights activist and leader, Rev Dr James Lawson, who says America still has a long struggle ahead of it. Here's Sheldon Neal with that story.
I think the public discussion in the United States is all wrong. It was wrong in the 60s, it's wrong in 2018. I'll tell you why I think it's wrong. In the first place, we have had no leadership in the USA that I know of a national, regional character that has wanted to demand the right of every resident to vote. That leadership has never been in my country.
When you look at the American landscape of voters now, the Black experience, what goes through your mind? Do you feel frustrated? Do you feel hopeful? What goes through your mind?
Well, I feel more angry than I feel frustrated, because we're at a stage in the United States where the opposition, the historic violence of our society, has come to the foreground in a great variety of elected officials. That may be their last gasp, but from my perspective, it may not be their last gasp. In contradiction to what many of them say and many people around the world say, I suspect that it will get worse before it gets better.
Will there be civil war, do you believe?
In some ways, when you've had the acts of violence and the killings that we've just had in the last 10 days, in some ways that does represent already a kind of civil war. It represents the numbers of people in our society who are persuaded that violence is the power that can most effect changes in their own lives and in their immediate environment. So that is, it seems to me, one evidence of the fact that we're already in tension. but intentions. But the tensions are not because of we the people. The tensions are because of the racism, the male chauvinism, and the sexism.
Ooh, Sheldon, I love that when you sit down with a 90-year-old wisdom guest like that.
It was a lot to take in, a very kind of golden moment. It was an absolute privilege to really sit down with Dr. Reverend James Lawson, a champion in the cause. There I felt, again, just privileged to sit down with him. He joined the civil rights movement in the 60s with his friend Martin Luther King Jr. at the age of 90. He's still working for the cause of love in the world. More on our website with the Good Reverend next week. Be sure to check it out, friends. Molly, back to you.
Thanks, Sheldon. Well, to another incredible interview from the Parliament. As thousands of migrants are approaching the U.S. border from Central America in a caravan, their fate is still unknown. Professor Miguel de la Torre came to America as an undocumented migrant from Cuba. Here's what he has to say about how Christians should approach this very serious issue. We are with author Miguel de la Torre. He is the author of The U.S. Immigration Crisis, The Ethic of Place. Miguel, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Miguel, there's a giant caravan headed towards the U.S. right now as we speak.
Yes.
Why does place matter so much in that?
Well, an ethics of place is trying to stand in solidarity with those in the caravan, not just looking at them from the safety of distance, but actually to be physically with them to see what exactly they're suffering and what they're going through, to get a better idea of how to respond.
How do we do that? We're here
Right.
in Canada on this side. How do we do that?
We do it by listening to their stories, not listening to politicians tell us who they are, but listening to their very stories. And there's many situations and there's many places where we could hear who these individuals are and why they are going to the United States to begin with.
Miguel, you fled from your home country. You came as an undocumented migrant into the U.S.
Yes.
Right now, people are so harsh towards these people trying to seek asylum. How does that make you feel when you're listening to this?
It dehumanizes me. It demonizes me. Because even though I do now have U.S. citizenship, the fact that every person of color, every brown person, every Latino person is automatically seen as not belonging until they can prove that they belong. So even though I've lived in the United States for some 60 years, I right now am a stranger in the country that I grew up in.
How far does our compassion extend?
And that's a good question, and it assumes that these individuals do not have a right to this land in the United States. But we have to remember that basically it was the invasion of Mexico back in the 1840s that stole the land of the Mexicans. So it's not the Mexicans crossing the borders, it's the borders that crossed them and continue to cross them economically during the 20th century. So the question becomes more complex than simply how many can we allow in. The real question becomes, what do we owe them? And because they're seeking asylum, every individual has a right to go to a country when they're threatening their own. So we should be sending attorneys to help them in that process of applying for asylum. But instead, we're sending the military. And we're creating a tinderbox situation that could end in violence. And that's what really should scare all of us.
Do you worry as you see your fellow Christians in the way that the majority seems to view this crisis in the U.S.?
It's more than worry, it scares me. The way these individuals have been demonized and the way that those who are advocating, shooting them and keeping them out, claim to be Christians. And I have no idea what kind of Christianity that is, but I want no part of it.
Here's a situation that needs healing. 47-year-old Asya Bibi has refused to renounce her faith in Christ. She's been released and resides in a makeshift jail cell for her own safety. But protesters are making it impossible for her to leave. Might the mother of five come to Canada? Lorna speaks with Wilson Chowdhry from London.
We keep saying it, never again. But genocides keep happening around the world. What defines a genocide? Human rights lawyer Irwin Cotler is here to discuss the horrors of genocide in a world that can do something about them, but doesn't.
The first action they need to take is admitting the depth of the problem in our churches. This is not just something that happens to the Hollywood elite or people in government or high Wall Street places. This happens in the church. It happens every day, and it has for millenniums.
I'm with Elizabeth Ersick, who is the chair of the Women's Task Force here at the Parliament of World Religions. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Elizabeth, the Me Too movement has been a massive reckoning for the world. Do you see that reckoning happening in religious circles as well?
Yes, it has been. It may be happening in ways that are a little different than we see in the public sphere, but this Me Too movement has given a reason for women, either quietly or more publicly, to tell their story. We recently went through some debate about a Supreme Court justice for appointment.
This confirmation process has become a national disgrace.
There were people in the Senate, men in the Senate, that talked about what might have changed their ways of thinking about things.
You have power when so many women are powerless.
It was both things that were very public being done, but then privately, the women who were connected to them through family and friends told their story. So I would say in religious circles, much is happening, but possibly not as public as we're seeing with Me Too.
For sure. How can women, I guess, of faith, different faiths, come together and lead this conversation and it not just be a trend of the moment, but it actually be a sustainable conversation?
When we think about the Parliament of World Religions, when it came back in 1993, very few institutionalized religions had policies against sexual harassment. And today, with 2018, at this Parliament, we issued an international declaration against sexual violence. Now, what we found in crafting that was that actually quite a few institutionalized religions, very many of them in fact, it's just now kind of standard to have these kinds of policies in place.
So Elizabeth, is there something in the conversation, in the Me Too conversation, that is not being talked about that should be talked about?
We need to have women and men of faith within all these different religions to be bringing forward the teachings that support standing up against this type of violence and abuse. And that work has been done, it needs to be publicized, and it needs to be institutionalized. We are seeing policies being written, but we need everybody in the faith communities to be taught and to understand that the teachings of their religion do not support this. In fact, we debuted an international Dignity of Women Interfaith Wisdom poster that shows scripturally from all these different world's religions that the dignity of women is a baseline for justice, and this is not to be tolerated anywhere, any place.
Wow, thanks Molly for that interview on the impact the Me Too movement is having on our entire world. Well, join me now as we dig into the idea of religions speaking truth to power, and the idea that standing by in the face of evil is the worst thing any of us can do. Linda Mercadante starts my conversation with a lesson in history. Take a look. Can you explain for those who have not heard, who are not familiar with the Barmen Declaration?
Right. Okay. The Barmen Declaration was a declaration done by part of Christianity in Nazi Germany. With the rise of National Socialism and Hitler's prominence, the state tried to say that it had control over the church. But a group arose among the churches who said, our authority is in Jesus Christ, not in the head of the state. And they crafted the Barmen Declaration to say that their authority was in Christ, not the national leader of the state.
Sometimes we talk about truth to power, it seems like, wow, the powers that be seem so big.
They are.
Sometimes you feel like you want to shrink back.
Yes,
so,
right.
But would you value that, or would you say indifference is a form of evil?
Is it evil? Maybe. It's definitely sin, which would be like personal evil. Jesus said, you know, if you are lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. Now that sounds kind of rough, but I think what he really meant is don't be indifferent to sin and evil.
What is the global ethic?
The global ethic is from the Parliament of the World's Religions. It was drafted in 1993, and it identifies the crises and the global situation that we're in, and it says that the world's faiths need to take stands to speak against these violations of their faith and their core values.
So when we look at the world today and there's such like a laundry list of atrocities, breaches of human rights,
right.
What are some, maybe on your personal, because I'm sure we could talk about all of them, but
right.
What are some, maybe one that burns on your heart that you feel that, you know what, Christians, religious backgrounds of all backgrounds really, should be not indifferent, but should be, you know, standing up and doing something about it?
Well, there's so many, but the one right now that is the most important to me is climate change.
Okay.
because there's so many injustices: poverty, hunger, violence, violations of minority and women's rights, persecution of faith traditions. All of that, as the speaker said yesterday, will be made much, much worse if the temperature in the environment rises too high.
There's an article I read long ago called Hemorrhaging Faith, and it was how millennials, younger generations, are actually running the opposite direction.
Right,
they see religion as being the cause of much division. So
right.
do you really feel religion, spirituality, no matter your denomination, is really the answer?
The problem isn't that it can't do it or it doesn't have that at its core. The problem is people are not following the teachings of their faith.
Okay.
If you went back to the core wisdom of your faith tradition and you actually followed it and acted on it, you would be a very strong force for good.
So you actually think it's enough? Well, what would you tell? What would you tell
it's not enough.
Okay.
No.
Go on. Okay.
I think we need. Well, a lot of my research is on people that are spiritual but not religious. So I don't actually just address faith communities, or even just Christianity. And so I think we need rallying points and areas of agreement with people that are not of particular religious traditions, so that we can all organize together and together work against these evils, which really we probably all agree on are evils. Most of us do. I mean, the people I interview who are spiritual but not religious agree that climate change is a pressing problem, agree that migrants have rights, agree that religious minorities shouldn't be persecuted. So we actually agree, but we need to unite. The thing about organized religion is that it brings hope to a situation, which is hard to find today. And that's what's really good about it, is that it has core wisdom and that it brings hope.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think if people see this footage, they'll say, oh my God, that's horrible. And then go on eating their dinners.
A clip from the riveting film Hotel Rwanda there, and the horrific story of a genocide. To an expert now on that subject, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General Irwin Cotler sits down with Sheldon.
What defines a genocide?
A genocide is defined in the Genocide Convention, which sets forth a series of acts which effectively refer to the killing of people in whole or in part, and with the intent to do so. So intentionality is important, and then the intent, as I say, to kill a whole people in whole or in part.
We keep hearing words such like never again, we're going to make sure we're our brother's keeper. When we talk about suffering happening with our Rohingya brothers and friends, our Muslims, Karen Christians, some people are really at vulnerable places right now. I'm curious to know, would you say our world is guilty of international genocide? Ignoring rather international genocide?
I think our world is certainly responsible for the indifference and inaction that takes us down the road to mass atrocity and genocide. So we need to intervene at the early stage and protect and prevent against, and I'm using one example, state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. But in all the things I was discussing today, regrettably, the real horror is not only the horror of the genocide itself, whether it be in the Holocaust or Rwanda or Darfur, or most recently with the Rohingya. The real horror is that these genocides were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act.
Why does it take so long for governments to call these killings a genocide? Is it denial? Is it indifference? What are they wrestling with, do you feel?
I think that some feel that if they call something a genocide, it imposes obligations that they wouldn't otherwise have.
So briefly then, what does the way forward look like?
Well, the way forward is, to use a Dickinsonian thing, it's the best of times and the worst of times. The good news is that we have all the international human rights law and remedy available to do what has to be done. The bad news is that we are not doing what has to be done. So what is necessary at this point is to take the law and the remedies at our disposal and to put it into effect.
From Britain now, Wilson Chowdhry, who is chairman of the British Christian Pakistani Association. Wilson, you have championed the Asya Bibi case for years. How did it get so dangerous on what we saw in the past few days?
I think the reason this blasphemy case was worse than any other situation that when a blasphemy case has occurred previously is the fact that there were words that were said and it was assumed that there were blasphemous words against the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, Asya Bibi had simply drunk water from a well. She put it into a bowl. She then shared it with some colleagues who threw the water back at her, telling her her ritual impurity had caused the contamination of both the bowl and the water in the pump. When they started to berate her for her faith and then her cry, she said, "My Christ died for me. What did Muhammad do for you?" Although in the Western world we would see this as a question, but in Pakistan, just the mere utterance of the name Muhammad in a question by a Christian caused all this hurt and anti-Christian sentiment. She was beaten fairly aggressively after that and has been incarcerated for 10 years. And it really does stem from the type of education system we have in Pakistan. In 2013, the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom wrote about how the Pakistani national curriculum demonizes caricatures and minorities, and even goes as far as listing Christians as spies for the West.
Okay, so let's just talk now about, there is the tragedy which happened to her at the well when she said, "My Jesus died for me." But what is so frightening is we watch thousands of people protesting. How do you stop that? Where does that re-education begin? And here we sit as a Canadian perspective, a British perspective. How do we make this better as religious leaders?
It may be too late for this generation. The incidents like this are not unusual. We've heard of cities being burned down. In 2009, Gordra was burnt down, which triggered the creation of the British Pakistani Christian Association. In 2014, St. Joseph's Colony. In the same year, Rimsha Masi was accused of blasphemy, an 11-year-old with a mental impairment. And again, her city was burned down. The only option, really, is to start with children from a young age. Change the national curriculum and bring in items such as religious education. Take out Islamic studies from the curriculum and make sure that all the offensive text is removed. Pakistan did once try to rectify the textbooks, but what they removed, they replaced with further offensive text. And so the 50% that was removed was replaced. And it does seem to me that often there isn't an appetite for change. If anything, the words from our government ministers in Pakistan are simply lip service.
All right. Wilson Chowdhry, from the chairman of the British Christian Pakistani Association and part of the country's asking for safe haven. Thank you very much. We can consume news of religious violence, or we can do more. We can be doers. We can be peacemakers. For example, did you know that Facebook has been weaponized for hate in nations far more religious than Canada? Private citizens venting hate against people different than themselves. That's not a new action, but it is an amplified action that moves faster now because we all have access to audiences. So take your access and spread love. Model making a difference for peace and welcoming people different than yourself. You know, this episode of Context airs amid Remembrance Day, and we remember that Canadian soldiers and peacekeepers have died to create peace, lest we forget. Thank you to the Canadian Legions who dispense millions of dollars each year to our soldiers, and we say thank you for those who served and are still serving our free nation. God keep our land glorious and free. From all of us at Context, we want to encourage you to go over to our website and Facebook pages and learn more about the fascinating guests you've been learning with. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lorna Duick.